Okay, so we are live. Hello, everyone. This is We Charge Colonialism. If you've been following us, you know that we are an organization that focuses very much on trying to raise the awareness of the fact that Africans in the United States are being colonized. And so this is going to be a very, very important debate because we're going to have time for us to really digest the information of what it means to be a colonized people in the United States. So before I get started, I do want to just shed light on two very, very prominent individuals in our community who are going to educate us. I'm here to learn just as much as everyone here. And so I want to introduce, if you have not been introduced to already, Dr. Jared Ball and also Dr. Cappy Penderhughes, sorry. So let's start with just some introductions if you want to introduce the people to yourselves and what you do and your line of work, and really give them a reference for how you came to be where you are right now.
Well, I guess I'll go first with that. I was in the civil rights and Black Power movement in the 60s, graduated high school 65, went south to work with SNCC. I was in SNCC for actually a couple of years during high school. Later joined the Black Panther Party, was the lieutenant of information there, and did some important work in the second wave of cadre who were sent to New Haven, Connecticut. And I've been interested in I think the question of Black people being colonized since the Black Panther era of the Black Panther Party. I still remember that 10th point of the 10-point platform. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And that's our major political objective. A United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the Black colony, in which only Black colonial subjects shall participate, so as to determine the will of the Black people as to their national destiny. Now, in ensuing years, decades, I've been community organizer, been in multinational Marxist formations, etc. Currently, I went back to school in the 90s and finally got my PhD in 2009, and landed a job at Essex County College in Newark, where I teach sociology. I am an independent Marxist sociologist there. However, my dissertation was on internal colonialism, a 21st century reassessment, I will call it, of internal colonialism. So that I really looked at it carefully. And I guess I'm going to stop with me right there and let Dr. Ball introduce himself, and then we can go forward with talking about the commonalities of the two approaches.
Okay, Dr. Ball.
First of all, good evening. I really appreciate these kinds of exchanges, and I'm definitely appreciative of having been invited to participate. My name is Jared Ball. I am a father, a husband, and a professor of communication studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, and I curate a multimedia website, imixwhatilike.org. I have been, for close to 2 decades and a variety of involved in various activist formations and organizations and supporting grassroots organization and multimedia and journalism production, and supporting as many radical endeavors as I've been able to. And somewhat similarly to Professor Penderhughes, when colonialism as an analysis, I had long appreciated from the first time I picked up Malcolm X and Frantz Fanon many, many years ago. But as I started working on my PhD and was trying to find a theoretical framework to justify an underground grassroots organizational journalistic project that I and some others had been developing called mixtape radio, or at the time in the early 2000s, the use of the hip hop mixtape as an underground communicative journalistic outreach mechanism. I wanted to find a framework to justify it, and in happenstance, while being somewhat punished by the administration at the University of Maryland, I, in isolation and exile, found a stack of communication theory journals slated for the trash, and in one of them found this brilliant article about something called emancipatory journalism by Professor Hemant Shah, a professor of journalism in Madison, Wisconsin. And in it, he argued for an anti-colonial form of journalism, which I thought perfectly suited the mixtape radio project I was working on and writing about. And to try to find a way to bring Black America into that frame, I wanted to develop at least a form of an internal colonial theory model. And admittedly, mine is somewhat differently put together, I think, maybe differently applied in some instances, or but one that I found exceedingly fruitful, and to this day, overall, the best framework to use. So that's how I come to it, and I've been applying a form, at least, of internal colonialism theory for, I don't know, at least 10, 15 years. So. And I'm happy to talk more about that and similarities and differences as we go forward.
Okay, so the subject of today is internal colonialism, the nature of it. So there are a lot of different theories about internal colonialism, and particularly we're going to deal with the issue of how do you categorize us? Are we a colony as a colony collectively in the United States, or should we be considered a colony based on the neighborhoods that Black people live in? So that's essentially what we're going to be getting at. Before we get to the differences in these two theories, I want to first talk about the commonalities. So for those who don't know what internal colonialism is, what is it? How is it applied, and why are Africans, Black people, why are we colonized in the United States? Let's start with Dr. Ball.
Well, the way I approach it, at least, the why we are a colony is that, simply put, African America was developed and created as part of the imperial process that Western Europe deployed, that ended up creating the batch of nations really around the entire world. And in fact, I don't think any singular current nation can say that it was evolved separate or outside the development of that Western imperial process. I think all of the world's countries are more or less colonially inspired in one way or another. So yes, there are particular differences, particularities in the way we were colonized, the way the colony was set up, obviously through enslavement. But it's ultimately, from my approach, at least, or preferred lens, it is the relationships that are developed socially, economically, geographically, etc., that are the most important and compelling tell that show that we are a colony. So African America was evolved through enslavement, even before the development of other African nations, and even some European nations were evolved. So in some cases, we have a national history that is longer and older than even some current so-called, even in some cases, more authentically African nations. Certainly, we predate the nation of Ghana. We predate the nation of Congo. We predate the nation of Egypt and Zimbabwe. We predate all of these nations. And all of them there on the continent here, all of those throughout Latin America, the so-called West Indies, et cetera, were created through this expansion, through this enslavement, through this imperial development of Western Europe. And set up a certain set of relationships. So I just started basing my version off of not only what many in the African world were saying in this country and throughout the diaspora, but I'll simply summarize it by looking at what Aimé Césaire said. Essentially, the colonial situation demands that, one, geographically, a colony be set up in distinction or geographic distinction from its so-called mother country. And certainly wherever we are in this country, Black people end up in isolation vis-a-vis white America. The labor and resources and the wealth produced in those colonies are extracted and repackaged and the benefits and the wealth redound to the country, so to speak, as is the case here. Black wealth and black labor, or black labor is exploited, and the wealth produced from it redounds almost entirely to the most elite of white America. And it's also a geographic location where the so-called, as I think Césaire put it, the ills of society can be dumped and blamed. So whether it's drugs, guns, sex work, violence, all of the most egregious products of colonialism can be deployed in Black communities and then targeted both for policing, surveillance, a so-called drug war, but also extraction in terms of, for instance, media for propaganda purposes, to be used to justify the very colonization that predates these conditions in the first place. So if we just look at those basic sets, as I was trying to do, we come up, I think, with something that clearly puts Black America within the colonial process. And therefore, for me, we can use anti-colonial frameworks and theories, which are far more, I think, revealing and substantive than certainly, ideas of democracy and what is it called? Pluralities and so on and so forth, that are the sort of the fantasies of bourgeois capitalism, white supremacy, in the United States state apparatus. So that's essentially, in summary, how I've tried to develop and use it, and where I think, being somewhat familiar with Professor Penderhugh's work, where there's some overlap and commonality, and that's at least where I try to start.
Dr. Penderhughes, do you agree with that as a general
in terms
definition
of the oppressive circumstances? Absolutely, we're on the same page. I want to just, when I did my work, I was looking at the question of internal colonialism as a sociologist initially, and I taught myself historical sociology, created my own I've created my own periodizations, not only for the question of internal colonialism, but also for the Black Panther Party, which, by the way, I'll just mention, I forgot to mention a project I've been working on this summer, and it's available now at blackpantheronline.com. It's my website that offers the opportunity for me to do speaking, presentations, and film discussions via webinar. And there are a number of different resources that are on the website, and more are added each month. But when I was first working on this, it was, I think it's 2005, I just put it together and found there was a lot of interest when I did a presentation at the American Sociological Association. Wrote a paper on it. Eventually, I wrote an area paper on it as a college student, grad student. But what I did was, as I got more into it, I realized that this is what I wanted to write my dissertation on. So I put down my first dissertation topic on Black student protest and started focusing on this. And I was able to come out with do a good job on it. But I had to go back to the beginning and look at what was the history, what was the how did this flow, and I wanted to attack the dismissals of internal colonialism theory that I saw in sociology. So as a result, that I concentrated just on that, and wrote the dissertation, which you could probably find online in Google Scholar, the 21st Century Chains, the continuing relevance of internal colonialism theory. But when I looked at that, we found we could start with the fact that Black people ourselves have considered ourselves colonized for the last 190 years. When I say that, the first evidence of this is a chart that I've put in my articles. It's the best summary of my work in print right now. That chart is of the various uh, uh, activists talking about this question from the first call of the National Negro Conventions in around 1830, saying that essentially we're a nation. Now, by the 1850s, Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass are talking about nation within a nation. And by the 1920s, by the Harlem Renaissance, many of the writers in the Harlem Renaissance would use that terminology. By Du Bois not only talks about a whole article about it in 1935 about the Negro nation within the nation, about how to survive the Depression using collective economics, cooperatives. And then in 44, he begins, he's the first person to start talking about colonialism. He calls it semi-colonialism, but Harold Cruz will call it domestic colonialism, but it's internal. Everybody's talking about internal colonialism. By the late 60s, all of the Black Power organizations, all of the national Black Power organizations had two things in common. This is from Kamosi Woodard, a important historian who wrote Nation, I believe it's Nation Time, Mary Brock and Black Power Politics. I may be getting that not quite right, but anyway, so he cites there that all of these organizations had two things in common. One, they all saw themselves as heirs of Malcolm X. And two, they all, and I'm talking about the RNA, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, and so forth. They all saw Black people as colonized. So there's a clear unity between this vision from people who are initially picking this up in sociology, as well as the activists. When I looked at it, though, I wanted to go back and break it down further. And so what I did, well, now maybe let me stop there, because I think I've covered the common points from a somewhat historical point of view. Are there any other questions on that common points before we talk about?
Let's go to the differences. So both of you, as was established, both of you do believe that we are being internally colonized. Now, what is the differences in your approach? So let's start with the first issue. How do each of you define what is a colony or the existence of a colony? So let's start with Dr. Pender Hughes.
Okay, so I just describe an internal colony as a geographically based pattern of subordination, a systematic pattern of subordination of a differentiated population located within the dominant power or country. That's my present day definition of what internal colonialism is. However, I'm going to add to that the basis of it is going back to the original 13 colony system and saying what is a colony, and saying it divides into two parts, and that those two parts are settler confiscated land and the land on which the colonized reside. And this, remember, I'm trying to do this as from the vision of the oppressed, not from the oppressor. So that the fact that they do not want to bother to even define the colonized in dictionaries up until the early 2000s. There wasn't even a definition, even though Memmi and Fanon were using it in the 1950s. The colonized was not a word that was defined as a noun. Similarly, there was no root word for the people who were oppressed in the colonies There was colonist, but the colonized didn't show up in the definitions. There was no other word that was root to the colony to represent those folks. And that includes us, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans at the minimum. Okay. So when you go back and look at that, regardless of what happens, the question is, what happened to the colonized? Whether if the colonists declare independence, that does not abolish the colony. But I'm getting into other questions, so I think I've answered that.
Okay, Dr. Ball, do you agree with this? And if not, why?
I'm not clear that I've heard anything I disagree with. So, I mean, my whole point was that. So I think one point I think that needs to be made more clear for me is that unlike Professor Penderhughes, I did not study internal colonialism theory as a distinct subject. And as I started off with, when I was first putting it together for my own dissertation and the first book I wrote, and at least one, I think, what I would consider strong article on the subject, I was trying to make an argument for why Black people should be considered a colony and why Black people should use a variation of internal colonialism theory as a response. So when, maybe if to the extent I understood what Professor Penderhughes was saying, I may disagree in the sense that on the one hand, yes, there was no language for the colonized being used, but to his point already made in terms of the National Black Convention, in terms of even David Walker's work, 1829, 1830, and the reference of a nation within a nation, certainly as he mentioned Martin Delany. I know this comes later, but to the extent that Black people were developing an understanding, a collective consciousness in the century preceding that under enslavement, I think there was a clear understanding evolving, whether the language is being used or not, that this nation within a nation did exist, and that it was, maybe for lack of the term itself, a colonial relationship. So for me, I was just trying to say the only real distinction between Black America's colonization and those that we might point to elsewhere was the process of enslavement that developed it, and to a certain extent that it occurred as an internal colony. That's what gave it the internal relationship, because the mother country exists within the same broader national boundary. The internally colonized community is not held in distinction, as would be the case between, say, Spain and Panama, or England and Ghana. But that the white settlers lived here and internally colonized Africans, and pointing to a question that we're going to come to later, other communities as well. And that it's the relationship that I find to be most compelling in terms of the Black community as a colony to the mother country, that it seems very similar, if not fundamentally the same, as existed between traditional colonies and the metropole that they were connected to. And that's the sort of pattern of existence, so to speak, that I think is most relevant and interesting to focus on. So for the most part, I didn't, but again, for the most part, I didn't hear anything that I think is substantially different than what Dr. Penderhughes said, unless, but I'd be happy to hear if he, substantively disagrees with what I've said.
Well, part of this question, okay, so by doing it the way I did it, by going back and saying, what are the components of a colony, the settler confiscated land, and land on which colonized resided, you get two effects. One, settler confiscated land never loses that character. 1,000 years from now, we in the United States will, if there is a United States, there will still be on settler confiscated land. And the other question is, what happens to the colonized from that? And what I've been able to show is an organic relationship through history of the life course of the internal colony. And that's why I think it's important. However, the key thing is that the land on which the colonized reside is important. And when additionally, when you look at the question of how the colonizers treated the definition of a colony, their definition was was for administrative convenience. They said, the Pitcairn Islands, 44 square kilometers, 17 square miles. That's a colony. And in addition, Angola, millions of, or 250,000 or more square miles.
So is this an area?
Colony, because it's an administrative category. So that's the thing I wanted to bring out. But so then, in order to then, when you apply that, coming down, look, where is the colony? Is the colony itself? Okay, is the internal colony itself is wherever the colonized are. And when the United States expanded after the American Revolutionary War, that bought with the Louisiana Purchase, that greatly expanded the territories open for slavery. And I would argue that more Native Americans came under direct administrative subordination of the United States after the Louisiana Purchase than before.
So we have a YouTube comment, Brother Omawale, how are you? He says, it's also important to note that there was never a question on the colonizers' part as to whether free African Americans would be colonized. The only question was where. So is this just an area where we agree on, and is it just a common agreement as to colonialism between all of us?
I mean, to me, again, what I'm hearing is very similar, because, again, to me, and I would maybe need to hear more from Professor Penderhughes here, because to me, once you establish the colony, whether, not to dismiss the never changing reality of the settler experience here, but once you establish the colonial relationship, they're largely the same. So they're fundamentally the same. Now, for me, a lot of the work I was doing involved a look at media, pop culture, the cultural realm as well. And this is where, again, I found profound similarities. So, for instance, this may be a point of disagreement that, to me, it's not just an administrative issue in terms of establishing the colony. As you point out, yes, they may have said this territory will be this and this territory will be that. And obviously the same thing happens here in the United States, where it is predetermined that this community will become black and this community will stay white and this community will become black. And then once that is established, the colonial relationship takes hold, that extractive, hostile relationship on the labor end. But then also culturally, the need, and this is where, again, I would go back to the old Memi, not so much the early Memi, not so much the new Memi,
yes.
And Fanon and all of them for looking at the cultural impact on the colony, which to me is almost identically the same wherever that situation takes place. So anyway, that's again where may be some similarities and again a slight difference, but or maybe not. I just maybe need to hear more.
So shall we move on to the bigger meat of the issue? That is, how do you test whether you're in a colony or not? And I want to say this in a framework of to Dr. Ball, and correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying that all of us Black people, we are all in the colony, as opposed to Dr. Penderhughes. You're saying that where we live as Black people, our neighborhoods, our communities that are basically subject to state surveillance. This is the colony. How do we test these two theories to actually obtain a understanding of what is happening and whether or not what the nature of our colonization essentially? This can go to Dr. Ball.
Well, for me, again, the test would be where can an individual African in America or a Black person in America go and not experience some variation of the colonial experience. And in other words, it's the relationship that has been manufactured and permanently assigned us. So it doesn't really matter necessarily where within the country we go, and it may be arguable that it doesn't matter where within the world we go. That relationship has been described. And that's why I was always attracted to Huey Newton's intercommunalism theory, which argued that there are no nations to which we can decolonize, that we're all in this intercommunal reactionary relationship with the so-called mother country, and we need to, with empire, and that needs to become a revolutionary intercommunal relationship. So I'm for me, it's ultimately a pathway to that. So I'm not really sure how else it could be determined that isn't the case. The only question would be what variation of that colonial experience. That meaning that is, there are the neo-colonial versions. There are the ones that allow for a bourgeois administrative class to emerge, and we see that on TV and in film all the time, and in politics all the time. But there is an but that is, again, no different than what we've seen in traditional colonies elsewhere. And that doesn't change the fundamental relationship that the entire community holds, regardless, again, where within this dominant colonial setting we go.
Dr. Penderhughes, what's your response?
Okay, well, first of all, Dr. Wall, we can debate the positive and negative of intercommunalism at another time. As a former Panther, I do have a strong critique of internal colonialism, but that's for another time.
You mean intercommunalism?
Intercommunalism, yes,
yeah.
That's right. But that's a separate question. There are good points about it, and some major flaws. But anyway, I was very much interested in attacking this concept of the colonial analogy, which is the way that one of the main ways that internal colonialism gets dismissed, and certainly in sociology, but I think in general, that no, it's just an analogy. It's like a colony. It's not a colony. No, it's a form of colony. And I actually have an unpublished framework of looking at internal and external, direct and indirect being neocolonial, and endocolonialism, looking at all of those stages. You're trying to use looking at the language of description of each of those, and only tweaking the really necessary differences between those stages. Now, so I wanted to get to wholeheartedly attack this question of analogy, because it was the way that people would say, well, yeah, we concede that it's analogy, but it's not the same. It's not a colony, really. So go away. And so I said, no. And so by looking at this as with that definition, the land on which the colonized reside, you have to figure out what happens to the colonized. And if the colonized move and they go to a new place, whether it's voluntary or not, and they face another geographically based systematic pattern of subordination in the new location, then that's still a colony. That means the colony can move. Oh, that means that explains how internal colonialism can fit into the Great Migration. That means that we can explain the rebellions in Paris or in the suburbs of Paris by immigrants in the mid-2000s, responding to police brutality, where they burned hundreds of cars. We can explain that as there's the land on which the colonized reside. These people emigrated from colonies and former colonies and are systematically subordinated there. So my formulation doesn't just address African Americans. As I said, it addressed the other historically colonized populations in the United States, and can be applied to other settler colony situations throughout the world, in my view. And that's so I feel like it's like it's tighter and more defensible intellectually, and that the only way to not address it and is to avoid it.
Dr. Ball, I'm sorry, Dr. Ball, what is your response to that?
I mean, I don't know that I have one other than to say that the framework that at least I feel like I was developing for use did the same thing. I mean, I certainly don't. I would argue that the form of internal colonialism theory that I was trying to use and still try to use is applicable to other oppressed communities. It's applicable to those same situations that Professor Pender Hughes talks about in other parts of the world. In fact, my entire point, and I couldn't find. I was trying to look for it before today, and I couldn't find it. It's somewhere buried in some things that I wrote that I just couldn't find. But in terms of the citation, but the argument that I'm borrowing from somebody who was writing in a Journal of Black Studies a couple decades ago, or maybe a decade plus ago, that the point of the theory was, or my point of use of the theory was to return, somewhat similar to what Dr. Clark used to say, to restore Black America back to the world stage. That with all of the specialness and particular history of Black people in this country that does exist, that it feels like we are often ignored and left off world stage conversations that involve colonialism and imperialism. And at the time, I was even pointing out, and even at one point tried to ask him about this, and then all of a sudden the email stopped. But when what's my man who wrote The Darker Nations? What's his name? Vijay Prashad, who wrote The Darker Nations. He wrote this book about, the sort of a global look at anti-colonial movements, and didn't mention Black people in the United States. And I wanted to ask him about that, because that to me was indicative of the problem I was trying to, on some small level, address with my small book about mixtape radio, was to say that what we are suffering here is fundamentally, it has its different variation and form, but fundamentally is no different than any other colonized community. And we should be able to bring to bear all of those theoretical responses and approaches, and all of those practical, tactical, militant responses to bear as well. So I'm not seeing the disagreement here. Other than to say that Professor Pender Hughes' work is much more focused directly on the theory and the history of the theory itself, and therefore he's going to clearly find nuances that I would not have found.
Let me just also indicate that both a mentor of mine, who, by the way, he shared your perspective, Dr. Ball, that it was that Black people were a single colony, yet he supported me very strongly. That was Rod Bush, who's passed. But both Rod and Robert L. Allen, who wrote to me to be the definitive initial text on internal colonialism from the point of view of the colonized, Black Awakening in Capitalist America. And when he followed that up with a revisiting of it, and showed his predictions about indirect rule that was made in 1969, substantially came true. But one of the things he did that, and Bush also, they connect with the concept of coloniality as the remnants of colonialism that are further afield than just the systematically subordinated territories. So, for example, just to make the distinction, boy, I'm pardon my brain freeze here. the young man that was killed in Florida 8 years ago.
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin. Yeah, Trayvon Martin that's actually the situation of coloniality. He was murdered in a suburb. And so that coloniality, the tentacles of the colonial rule still stretch further than the colony. Okay. Now that's one of the things that I look at, and I've had vigorous arguments with some people from a nationalist perspective. Say, "Oh, you're liquidating the Black nation." Well, we're dispersed in very different places, and in order for us to make change, we're going to have to make change within the national situation that we're in. We're not going to be able to create an independent country in 200 communities spread over 50 states, or however many you want to put in it. We're not going to be able to create a separate country and administrate that. We should be able to fight for self-determination in each of those areas. But I also follow that up with looking at the question of how do you abolish a colony? I could only find 3 ways. But I'm sorry, but you want to stop and?
Yeah, I just don't want us to linger too much. I do want to get to some of these questions on YouTube really quickly. Dr. Penderhughes, you spoke about your critique of communalism. Where can that be found?
I haven't published it yet, but I'll be glad to have a discussion with anybody. And I need to get these ideas down and publish them anyway. Yes.
Okay. So within your different frameworks, are white people the only colonizers? That's a really good question that we got.
Oh no. What do you think the Japanese were doing all over the Pacific before World War II, for example?
Okay.
Yeah. And the Germans were doing that to their fellow Europeans.
I mean, and even if we go back to antiquity, I mean, Kemet colonized other parts of the world, so I mean, people have put a positive spin on it, and maybe there's one to be put on it. But the fact remains that what they did was create colonies subservient to them. And again, what I think is important and what the work we're all collectively trying to do here is to remind people that those processes are still going on, and Black people here are just as much a part of those processes as anybody has ever been. And we should be reminded of that, especially now in an election season. Mm-hmm. I do want to say very quickly, I think it's important to note that you raised his name already. I think it's important to note that you and I were brought into community initially through Robert Allen, again, through you and Rod Bush. And I think that both of them have exemplified for a long time a lot of what is missing today, a willingness to engage people with whom they disagree within a certain framework, and a willingness to discuss and support and so on. I felt very supported by Professor Bush as much as I did by Professor Allen, who ultimately disagreed with me as much as I loved his book and leaned on his work, who ultimately disagreed with our conclusions on Obama at the time, for instance. The efficacy of supporting him. But the point being, I just think it's important to note that these differences were, I think, handled cordially as they're supposed to be, and not turned into, silliness that we see too much right now.
Okay, so I just want to get to one more question before we move to the next area of our discussion. JG asks, does subnationalism do any work? I think that the special imagination of Black nationalism is unified enough to include everyone in the African diaspora. Do any of you have a comment on that?
The idea of a collective global one African nation, is that what I'm hearing in the question?
Yeah, that's my understanding of it. Does that do any work when you're talking about internal colonialism? JG, if I didn't represent your question well enough, you can clarify.
To the extent that I understand it, to me, it's extremely important. My approach to Pan-Africanism is ultimately to say that, with, again, important key differences, generally, wherever you find African people, the colonial relationship holds currently, at least in this time, to Western Europe, and her allies. So so that oneness to me is essential in understanding, and I think that's the pathway to whatever solutions we may develop. Because to Dr. Penderhuse's point, I don't think we can expect a separate nation within this nation, but theoretically, at least for me, a goal, an aspiration would be to see a Pan-African unity that would make the individual nation state less relevant in terms of the conditions of African people wherever they may find themselves.
Dr. Penderhuse, do you have a comment on that?
I'm going to disagree with the proposition, and I'm going to do it by looking at Fanon and Amilcar Cabral. Fanon looked at each of the countries and talked about, well, not each of the countries. He looked at the Algerian Revolution, but he wrote in such a generalistic way that many other people were embraced it. Matter of fact, I was introduced to the book by two sub-Saharan African students at my college. I said, you got to read this book. One of the things he talks about is in his case, he talks about he has a positive spin on the question of the lumpen proletariat, what Marx thought of as the parasites on the proletariat who didn't have a job or unemployment. There were no social supports except family, so he considered them to be very negative. But Fanon says, well, they're important. They're youth that come from the rural areas and they come to the cities and they get educated in the nationalism that's developing there, and they take that back to the countryside, and that begins to knit the colony, which is made up of a number of different groups that primarily identify with themselves, into a nation. Now, and this is in a French colony, and the same thing happened in a British colony, in Portuguese colonies. Portugal was the poorest of the countries of the colonizing countries of Europe, and so they barely developed their country at all. So that kind of development didn't happen. And Amilcar Cabral talks about educating people to a level of a nationalist understanding. Okay, now, so that's what we're facing, and what people in the various countries around the world that have people of African descent in them, there's a portion who are intellectual, who can make that Pan-African connection. But many people are looking at how they survive and given the capitalist system that they're facing. And they don't really, this question of Africa, liberating Africa so that we can enjoy a better situation is not generally on their minds. And so because of that, I think we really need to keep in mind that yes, Du Bois as an intellectual was, some people call him the father of Pan-Africanism, participated in helped to create 5 of those Pan-African Congresses before, I guess, World War II. But still, it was talking to like-minded African intellectuals. And unfortunately, it's a great idea. However, my sense of how empire is confronted and how the battle against capitalism goes, where there's a weakness, there's a breakthrough, and then there's back and forth and gains and losses. I think that the unification of Africa is probably going to come after the end of the U.S. empire, not before, unfortunately, because the U.S. empire is up in there. They have an. I didn't know this until I looked up. I was looking at what's going on, trying to look at what's going on in the Mali coup, and one of the people who's was very laid back, but then said he was running the show. He goes to this annual exercise that the U.S. does in Africa to train people.
Yeah, it's all AFRICOM, it's all Western corporations, all of these things. You know, this is a decades-long problem where I remember, literally they were talking about at one point, Chevron was controlling Nigeria's military. Yeah. So, the only thing I would want to just add very quickly, just to complicate things a little bit, is that Cabral did not agree that Black people were internally colonized here. So as much as I and others have used and loved his analysis, he did not agree with either of us on that point. And though I've never really found where he fully explains that. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Okay, so regardless of the approach, both of us, all of us, we see that we're colonized. And how do we basically abolish the colony as an African people? How do we abolish it if we are all colonized in the United States? And how do we abolish it if we're colonized in our localized communities? Who did I start with last time? I can't recall. We'll go to Dr. Penderhughes. You can go ahead.
Okay, well, so I had to ask that question. How, part of this question is, if the colony is so durable, it survives, it moves, and so forth, how do you abolish it? And that there was only three ways I could identify. One is the spontaneous collective assimilation as happened with the German, Irish, Jewish, and Italian internal colonies of the early 20th century. Okay, then that's not happening with people coming in the United States today. That's pretty clear, especially not African Americans. Second is ethnic cleansing. Okay. And by the way, we've had at least 3 incidents of ethnic cleansing that have changed the racial composition of cities in the 21st century. The government response to Katrina, the government response, of course, to Maria, and the water policy pursued in Detroit, turning people's water off at a rate of 3,500 a week. Okay. Those policies are ethnic cleansing policies. Anyway, but then the third one is a policy of proactive abolition, meaning pursuing policies of equality of result, not just opportunity. In other words, you may still have an ethnic enclave, but if you abolish the differentials in infant mortality, unemployment, education, housing, etc., then you've abolished the differential relationship, that differential system. Like you still may have an enclave, an ethnic enclave, but it's no longer a systematic subordination to the dominant population.
How about that, you, Dr.
What?
We certainly agree there. And in the work I've done on this issue, the only focus I've maintained any work on or look at was the final point that he makes, Dr. Penderhughes makes about positive abolition. Mm-hmm. And for that, I have just summarized, simply gone to George Jackson and his 3-pronged platform, only 2 of which, admittedly, I've been willing to engage. So he said that we need to develop a secret army, which I have not participated in. We need to, what I have developed or supported are the development of underground alternative media and journalism and alternative political parties. Because for me, similar, I think, to what Professor Penderhughes is saying, is that the only way to positively abolish a colony is to have the empire itself be ended one way or another. So if we can end the American empire by a social movement, a political movement that assumes political power and redistributes the wealth that is created to get to the point that Professor Penderhughes is talking about, where we have equal outcomes and not just opportunity, that would be one way of doing it. And then to also his point, that might help free up the colonial relationships held elsewhere on the planet. And that's the kind of work I have always wanted to be involved in and continue to advocate for now.
I would add, this is where reparations, I call it collective reparations, comes in. Collective reparations is the funding mechanism for actually producing that equality result. Okay.
So it sounds like, regardless of the theory of internal colonialism that you subscribe to, or the nature of our colonization, that essentially the methods that we liberate ourselves are going to be the same. Am I correct?
Not quite. Not quite. There's still a question. And I think the events in Wisconsin have raised this question up a little bit further. How is the struggle going to, what is the struggle going to be in the end, okay, of American power? Is it going to be a race struggle? Is it going to be a class struggle? Is it going to be a civil war? Well, it's a civil war, race war, class war. Let me put it like that. So in a civil war, okay, then the white community is going to break down on both sides, and we're going to, we're going to have casualties like the Civil War of 150 years ago, or so. If we don't build alliances with allies who are willing to, and by the way, am I correct that the folks who got killed were white?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
I thought one of them was. The other one was a brother, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you for the correction, because it wasn't. That's one of the things that seems to be like being kept under the table for whatever reason. So the question of allies, since we are in a minority, we're way less than 20% of the population, no matter how you want to count it, as Black people. So then there's other populations. There's a major portion of the Latino population that could be connected to. But if we don't have some white allies, it's going to be a hot time. So I would prefer the class war model, okay, where we can. But right now, if you extrapolate the conditions of right now, then it's going to be that would probably be a civil war. Be better than a pure race war. That was basically what the Germans did with the Jews. They didn't call it a war, but it was on the Jews, a race war.
Well, that was a pogrom then, and that wasn't a war. That was one-sided, and
What I'm saying is that's the function of it. Yeah, I hear you. And we've had pogroms here. That 1830 letter from the Negro Convention movement, calling that was acknowledging the 50% of Cincinnati that moved to Canada after the white riot occurred, when Black people started protesting a $500 tax in 1830 money on Black people.
But same thing now. I mean, when NBA players go on strike, it may be whatever we think it is, but that is them standing up to say this is not a war. Mm-hmm. They're saying, please stop the pogrom. Mm-hmm. the one-sided abuse. And this is why I think George Jackson was right analytically. I just think I admittedly, and many among us, are not situated certainly to publicly discuss being a part of a secret army. But his point was part of those, and Daruba bin Wahad said this in an interview recently with me, that the pain has to be felt on both sides, regardless of the formation of the construction of the war, whether it's race, class, or civil. If the pain is only felt on one side, it's not a war, it's just a pogrom, and all we're doing right now is putting our hands up and pleading, to say, please stop the one-sided level of abuse, because there's no black violent response happening against white people or even just the police. So anyway,
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I have one more question from us, and then I think we'll wrap up with one of our questions from our audience. So particularly, Dr. Ball, I know that you are very adamant about preaching against this idea of the Black buying power. How does economics, us subscribing to this idea that we can basically pay our way out of oppression, how does that deal with us being a colonized people in the United States? And how does it hurt the movement to decolonize or to disrupt the colony?
So, again, I've said this before, if the buying power book is the most public and soft political argument I've ever made, in part because I tried to leave all of my real political analysis out of it just to get people to focus on the argument itself. But if we understand ourselves to be colonized, this is not something that, colonialism, I think Professor Penhughes just outlined it perfectly. I didn't hear him in any of his potential ways to get rid of colonialism. I didn't hear him say anything about consumption habits or buying habits of the poor being part of the model to get us free. And this is sort of the point. For me, it has always been, my use of this analysis or this theory or this theoretical approach has always been about trying to get as many people who pay attention to me as I can to realize that the relationship we have to this economy, to this society, is far more harmful and dangerous, and also necessary to the maintenance of this society than we often want to acknowledge. So we cannot just simply vote it out if voting means following the conventional patterns of voting. We cannot simply consume our way out of colonialism by being more quote unquote financially literate with our money. We cannot end colonialism by boycotting or buying black or banking black. These don't change the relationships, the colonial relationships that have to require much more aggressive and structural aggressive attack and destruction to break those the colonial binds or the coloniality that Professor Penhughes was talking about. So that essentially, simply put, that would be my point there. That if the argument I put in the book argues for public policy and a social movement that calls for a redistribution of the country's GDP to get to the point, without saying it the way he said it, that we have the the equality of outcome, if not opportunity. And then we would be able to get to a more, I think, safe space where we could have the more complicated conversations about what to build and go for next. But essentially, that's my point, that once we understand the colonial relationship, and my point about bringing up the cultural component earlier, is that beyond the geographic or even the political or material purpose of the colony, it is that immaterial purpose of the colony that the Western world and empires require so much, which is the reminder of the false promotion of whiteness as superior. One of the reasons Portugal hung on to its colonies so long, despite being poorest in Western Europe and et cetera, was for just the symbolic a self-concept of being superior and saying to their other European friends, look, we still have colonies too. So this is about projecting a negative images of African and black people to which is the equal component to projecting a superiority of whiteness. So there's a whole immaterial component to this as well that cannot just be undone by the simple, again, bourgeois claims of consumption or voting.
Dr. Penderhughes, do you agree?
Yes, I do. I want to apologize. This has been a very unusual summer, and it is sitting on my desktop in a PDF, but I have not yet read your book. So forgive me if I'm repeating anything that is in it. But one of the things as a sociologist, when I go to a place like the American Sociological Association to present or whatever, I get at, what's your proof that this exists? How, other than in your own mind? And I realized that, the proof is really when all of the classes in the Black community are subordinated. That's it. Okay. In addition to the definition of the colony. In other words, when and in the case of the Black capitalist class, they've been only relatively a few individuals that have not been able to act as a class because the white capitalist class has subordinated them too. Now, they subordinate the Black capitalist class in a different way than subordinate Black workers, but there's gross impact there. Now, as a result, the Black capitalist class is in its scramble. It's willing to ally with the existing capitalist structure, and launches this slogan, the idea of buy Black and that'll save us. Okay, that's my take on how that. I don't know if that connects with the material you've been writing about or not, but that's how I understand this. And that goes back to this question of you asked about the proof, and so that is the actual proof. It's as simple as the actual Black class analysis. By the way, I'll stop there.
Okay, so we're over an hour, so let's just wrap it up. I've seen this question earlier, and I thought it was a good way to end out. It is to Dr. Penderhughes. This is from Baruti Katambo. He says, to Dr. Penderhughes and Dr. Ball, what should be the current response and associated actions of African/Black people in the United States to being colonized, and what is the pathway forward? Let's start. I believe I started with Dr. Ball, so let's start with Dr. Penderhughes.
Okay. Well, you started with Dr. Penderhughes last time, but I'll go ahead. So my view is that we need to exhaust, fight for self-determination, community control in our communities, exhausting all the legal needs. But we need to build allied relationships as well, okay, so that our allies can see that when, what we do. Now, I do have a critique of the secret army. I'm fully in support of that idea, but it should not ever substitute for the mass struggle of our people. The mass movement should be guarded by that, but it should not be done instead of or in substitute for.
Dr. Ball, your answer?
I don't have it in front of me, but unfortunately, George Jackson was clear. He said that the army, the underground press, and the political party had to work hand in hand collectively, none stronger or weaker than the other for the process to work. And I think that's correct. And I largely would start with that as a solution. I think we need to be better organized. I think we need to be better organized in not just political organizations, but in the production of journalism and media. I think a lot of these networks and platforms need to unify in various ways, collapse in various ways, and to project and promote themselves and to magnify themselves stronger. For all the talk of Russia and all this other stuff, then the mainstream liberal press, one thing that has always been left out as to why Trump won is the well-organized right-wing underground reactionary conservative white supremacist media network that almost nobody pays attention to, but is extremely powerful, far more powerful than our networks, and is propelling all kinds of nonsense. And then I think that we need to, and of course we need to accept the colonial relationship in whatever variation, and then move on that basis. And then once we're in the rooms, in organizations, and offline and off mic and off camera, I think all the real solutions will be developed. But I do think we need alternative political parties or movements within parties. I think we need certainly, again, alternative press mechanisms and media mechanisms to have these kinds of conversations magnified and have this analysis projected on a more regular basis in terms of interpreting daily events. And then I think we would see, the related progress from that.
Okay, so I think that about wraps it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you especially to Dr. Prenderhughes and Dr. Ball. Do you want to give any information about anything that you have coming up, or where you can be found?
I'll just point to three things. I believe my article toward a new theory of internal colonialism is available online in Google Scholar. Anybody who writes me, I will give, just for educational purposes, mind you, I'll give you the article that I wrote about my dialogue with Rod Bush on internal colonialism in a recently published book. And please be sure to visit blackpantheronline.com. And it's really focused on trying to provide materials and discussion for grade 6 through college educators.
For me, again, thank you for hosting this, and for everybody attending. I think this has been great. And all my stuff is at imixwhatilike.org or at imixwhatilike for all your relevant social media. And I'm happy to continue these conversations. We have a pretty good library of stuff on this topic at that website, interviews and essays and stuff as well by me and others that everybody can find. And look forward to continuing this. And thank you all very much.
And for us, if you're interested in learning more about We Charge Colonialism, you can go to wechargecolonialism.org. You can also email us at wechargecolonialism@gmail.com. That about wraps us up. So thank you again. We will see you guys in the next broadcast.
Take it light, but take it. Yes.